Processor clock speeds. Processor clock speeds in modern day computers are measured in gigahertz. Now, older computers, you would see where they stated that the clock speed was in megahertz. So you would see the clock speed and MHz for megahertz for older computers. But if you look at your computer now, if you have an up to date computer, especially a computer that was purchased in the last 5 or 6 years, the processor clock speed should be measured in gigahertz. So when it comes to clock speed, the speed is measured by clock cycle. So a clock cycle is a simple electrical pulse in a CPU. And the electrical pulse performs instructions and tasks every time an instruction makes it to the CPU to be processed. Different programs and instructions are not always equal. Some programs and some instructions that come to the CPU requires more processing power than others. So every task you conduct on your computer takes a certain amount of time, and that time is measured in clock cycles. So when comparing processors, you should compare processors in the same brand, same generation. And what I mean by generation, a lot of times when a processor vendor comes out with a new set of processor, they might say, hey, this is generation two, generation three, and so on and so on. So you have a processor that was a Gen 1 processor, and now you have a Gen 3 processor, and let's say both of them are i3. Well, it's not a true comparison because the technology has advanced from that i3 Gen 1 to that i3 Gen Gen 3 processor. Also, CPUs, as the technology progress, a CPU with a higher clock speed in the past might not outperform a PC with a lower clock speed because as technology progressed, the technology was improved to allow CPUs with smaller and shorter clock speeds to perform. So not only when you're looking at a processor or looking at a computer and you notice the processor speed that is published, it's also good to see if you can find out IPC instructions per second. Yeah, a lot of times when you're purchasing a computer, you won't see the IPC instruction per second, but sometimes you can do some research. You can go to the vendor website, whether it's Intel, AMD processor, and look to see if you can find the instruction per second for that processor. Overclocking. So overclocking is something that is done when you want to speed up the CPU clock. So when you get your computer, it's going to be set at a default setting, and most people need to leave it at that default setting. But if you have some tasks that you believe would benefit if your computer processor ran at a faster speed, overclocking is something that you can go inside the BIOS settings to set. Overclocking pretty much as it says, you're able to speed up the clock and set the clock over the default setting. And it allows the processor to perform more operations per second. Like I said in the earlier slide, The processor's speed is measured by how many instructions per second can be performed. Intel, as a part of their marketing, if Intel has a letter K next to that processor, that means that it can be overclocked. But e- even processors that don't have the K next to their name, a lot of time they can be overclocked as well. But overclocking isn't something you want to do as a casual thing to do. You need to know what you're doing when you're overclocking a computer because you can overclock it and you don't really need it to be overclocked to run it at a faster speed, and you can end up doing damage to your computer. So if the clock is set too high, you might have issues with your PC rebooting or blue screening, and it might be doing it because it's getting hot. Think about it. When you set the processor to overclock, now you have the processor working overtime. So think about a runner running at a track beat. You know, they have their pace down packed well. Now they start running a whole lot faster. So think about it. The human body is going to start getting tired, more prone for injury. So same thing with overclocking.